is Kim McQuarrie, the Director of Community Programming and the Co-Director of Innovation Labs here at the Dali Museum. Happy to welcome you back for another episode of our bi-monthly podcast, Follow the Tangent, Archives, Art, and Anecdotes. Today, we have a special guest here, our head librarian and registrar, Shaina Harkness, and she is going to be helping to answer some questions from our viewer mailbag. Welcome to the podcast, Shaina.
Thanks, Kim.
Yeah, so over the past year that we have been filming episodes, we've had many viewer questions. They're really curious about different things, about the archives, about the collection, and we have a selection of those questions that we want to talk about today. So maybe before we dig into the first set of questions, which are about the archives, why don't we go back and just refresh about the definition of the archives for our viewers? So what are archives?
Yes, and I think I had said this in the very first Follow the Tangent. Here, I also combine special collections and archives.
Mm-hmm.
So these are items that are in a physical building out of the library and a room attached to the library. And this is not the art collection.
Mm-hmm.
These are papers, special books, odd objects here and there that relate to our collection,
Mm-hmm.
but it is not the art collection. It helps us study our art collection,
Mm-hmm.
the archives and special collections.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for refreshing us on that. I think it'll be really helpful to understand these questions in that context. So our first question is, what do you keep in the rare book room?
Okay, so we have a plethora of items, and rare book room and archives are kind of used both in the same term. They're interchangeable here, but we collect the old Surrealist journals, things like Minotaur, Variety from the 30s, the 20s, things like that. Surrealist publications, these are books, so rare books. We keep correspondence. The majority of the correspondence is museum related and A. Reynolds and Eleanor Morse related. Other things, generally all the museum ephemera that we have produced from the beginning stages of the museum from 1971 in Beechwood, Ohio, to the present. So that is what is housed. Photographs, some photographs that were put in binders of the museum, some copies of photographs of Dali and places of Dali. Those are all held in the rare book room.
Now, this viewer has an interesting take and wants to know, what's the strangest thing in the archives?
This took some time to contemplate, and I was going through some items and I ran across, and I hadn't run across it in quite a few years, and I was like, oh yes, this is strange, and I'm just gonna hold it up for the camera, and as you see, on first glance it looks like a regular fork, but then when we turn to the side, it is a bent fork. And we try and keep track. If we don't have it in a spreadsheet or a database, I at least have handwritten notes. So on this handwritten notes, it says this was one of Uri Geller's bent forks that was given to A. Reynolds Morse at a party. And for those of you who may not know, Uri Geller was an Israeli mentalist and illusionist. He knew Dali. They attended parties together, first in Barcelona, and this is in the 70s. This particular fork was from a St. Regis party in 1975, in which A. Reynolds and Eleanor Morse were in attendance. So we keep it in the archives.
And so we're to believe that Uri bent this tine back with the power of his mind.
Yes, it was given to Eleanor at this party after he bent it. So now it is forever housed in our archives as just one little fascinating piece, a facet of Dali's career, the entourage in the 70s. So we have physical evidence of that. And of course, this is one of my favorites. I believe I had talked about it in the very beginning of Follow the Tangent. We just have a tray of signed tennis balls by Dali. And Mr. Morse just asked Dali to sign a bunch of tennis balls. So they remain in the archives because, as Mr. Morse would have put it, the master had his hand on it. So those are two of the strangest items.
Yeah, those are definitely off the beaten path.
Yes.
Now our next question is related, but it's a different angle, and that is what's the rarest item that we have in our archives?
The rarest, and that's a hard term to define. We want rare. It can be completely unique, and that is what the definition that I'm using. I'm going to use unique, one and only. That doesn't necessarily mean it's rare, but in these terms it does. And this is probably our most unique, our rarest item. This is a journal of Dali when he was 16 years old. Now, he wrote many of these. He was an avid journal writer. And so this is just one in a series of that year. I believe the foundation may own the others, but Mr. Morse was able to buy this many years ago. And it's in Dali's handwriting. It has to stay in the archives for the majority of the time so the ink doesn't fade. But it's in cursive. It's in Catalan, which, as Dali grew older, he wouldn't write in Catalan. He tended to write in French, mainly. So we have this beautiful example of Dali's written word in his early years. And a lot of it, he's talking about the weather or his environment. And he's also talking a lot about politics. So this is a 16-year-old in Spain. He's talking about politics. It's really fascinating. And it was so fascinating that shortly after Mr. Morse purchased it, he had someone translate it and he published this. So it's in English, but then what Mr. Morse decided to do, since it's kind of, in some people's eyes, if there isn't anything visual, it's not as exciting. So Mr. Morse took childhood sketches that he owned of Dali and placed them in the translated journal. So this is something that we just house in our normal library collection. And then the journal itself is in the rare book room, the archives.
Now, the handwritten journal, that penmanship, first of all, looks beautiful and amazing. Has anyone ever taken any of Dali's handwritten documents and done handwriting analysis?
I believe I have a folder somewhere. There was a scholar, I can't remember the date. There was a paper on it. And I would have to find that information, but I know I have seen that in passing somewhere. And I couldn't tell you if it was published worldwide or if it was something that was just sent to the museum. But we do have something related to that. And maybe I should revisit.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure how much stock I put in handwriting analysis, but certainly it's a facet of somebody's character.
Yes.
So, interesting. Now, the next question we have is a little bit broader. So we've talked about the archives and what they are and, some of these unique objects, whether strange or rare. But this question is more foundational, and that is about the growth of the archives and if we are still in the process of building our archives.
Okay, and that is gonna be a yes and no response. No in the terms of collections of correspondence, like large. Sometimes when people think of archives, they think boxes upon boxes of letters.
Mm-hmm.
So in that regard, no, we are not collecting that. What we have is what we have. But on the other side, we do still collect Dali exhibit catalogs, early surrealist catalogs, or the avant-garde artists.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking from the 20s, 30s. We're still trying to fill in some gaps. Over the years, Mr. Morse, and then later with the museum, we have filled in a lot of gaps,
Mm-hmm.
but there's just a few that we're still seeking out. So the catalogs also, there's a few surrealist journals that we would like to have in their entirety. Again, we've made great strides and we have a lot of them in complete sets. And especially now, it's harder and harder to find. But we are still seeking those type of items out. Also, the past couple years for our archives, we have been seeking out photographs of Dali, in which we have been able to purchase a few that have come up on auction that just help tell more of Dali's story, finding photographs from famous artists from a certain time period helps add to our story of our archive.
And I think that's something that we've talked a lot in terms of the formalistic definition of archives. But I like the way you put it right there. I mean, the archives really exists in order to help tell a story.
Yes.
And, that's what we're really doing here at the museum, is telling the story of this incredible artist and this work that he produced, and then this collection that was kind of put together and now, shared with the rest of the world. So,
yes. And this is vital that we tell this story, and we're able to with all these items in the archives. And as we continue to grow on certain aspects of it, and further along in history, 50, 100 years from now, we are still collecting museum ephemera, so that will continue to tell the story of the museum. So I'm always looking ahead 100 years, because it's not just my lifetime or the next generation's lifetime, but we're thinking far in advance.
That's a heavy responsibility. You wear it well. Now, this question is a pretty specific one. So this viewer had actually met someone from the Morse's circle some years ago who mentioned that Mr. Morse kept some little books or journals. Do we have those? What's the story?
So currently we at the museum, we're looking into publishing, releasing excerpts from these journals, from Mr. Morse's journals in the future.
Okay. Awesome. Now, I know that you mentioned that we are still in this building phase, but it's a kind of very measured and precise building. But let's put all that aside and pretend that you have a magic wand. If you had a magic wand, is there some certain item that you would just wave it to get for the archives if you could?
And this, it's not just my personal wanting. I did have a discussion with Dr. Jeffett, and I already knew the answer in advance, but that golden goblet is the 1947 International Surrealist Exhibition catalog from Paris. This is the one item that we are really, this would be heaven if we were able to acquire this for the archives.
Have you seen any of them go up for auction in recent years?
Yes, they are. We have been tracking it closely for 5 years. I believe Dr. Jeffett has been tracking it for even longer. So occasionally they do come up for auction. The issue is no one really knows how many were made.
Okay.
So we don't have a definitive number. And they're very, very fragile. So fewer and fewer are going up.
Mm-hmm.
And the price has just skyrocketed.
Now,
but I always have hope.
Of course. If we don't have that, what do we have?
Yes.
And remember, it's your magic wand, so you can do with it what you will. Now, this is a very specific question. How do artistic rights work for collaboration? So, for example, when Dali and Schiaparelli collaborated on something, who owns that intellectual property?
This is a fun topic because we still to this day, we have to handle that topic when we reproduce something. And the short answer is they both do. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, the lobster dress. Schiaparelli physically made it with all of the materials and all of that. But Dali did the sketch. Mm-hmm. So it was a true collaboration. So they both own intellectual property rights to it. Mm-hmm. So for instance, when we did the Dali and Schiaparelli catalog and had to reproduce that, we had to get permission from both estates.
Okay. Interesting. And then kind of rounding out these archives questions, we have a couple about correspondence. And one is, who was Dali's most prolific correspondent?
Now, this one I'm not going to be able to answer possibly as what they would hope, because I am unsure. This museum is not the holder of Dali's personal correspondence, although we do have correspondence between the Dalis and the Morrises. So his correspondence, his papers reside at the Dali Foundation in Spain. Okay. But we do know I have been on several research trips where I've gone to different archives. He was in contact with, of course, his art dealers, Julian Levy, Edward James, who was his patron. So Dali was in constant correspondence. And could be funny to some, Gala was in fact who did most of the correspondence. There are letters from Dali, but after the early 30s, we kind of just see a shift, where Gala took over that responsibility and did most of the correspondence.
That's interesting. And actually, the last archive-related question mentions Gala. So did Dali and Gala exchange any letters? And if so, in what language?
I am unsure. I was able to find a transcript of one very early on, right before they were meeting or around that time in 29. And it was Gala to Dali in French. That was the language that they conversed in. It was a shared language for them. But that is something that has piqued my curiosity. And I would probably have to ask the Dali Foundation if they hold letters between the two of them. I wouldn't be able to say how many because they were generally together all the time with their relationship. Now, we do know they wrote letters when Dali would have to seek permission to go to Castle Poubal. So we know that there's those letters.
That was later in the relationship.
That was later in the relationship.
Okay. Now, obviously, our podcast, Follow the Tangent, has archives, but we also have art and anecdotes. And so some of our viewers have written in with some questions that are more about the art, maybe things that are in our collection or things that are held in our vault. So why don't we turn to those questions? The first one is there a bibliography online or on paper so that people can know all the titles and the pieces in the entire collection?
So what we've had since about 2016 is our online collection. There you will find every oil, every work on paper that we have complete.
Mm-hmm.
It is online. You can see the title, date, the information that we have. We also have a section for prints and book illustrations. It is not complete, but it has a large amount of items in our collection. Also photographs. That I believe is almost complete of all the titles the photo titles that we have and which photographers. And then objects, which is not complete. We have the main surrealist objects like the shoe, Venus, but that I'm slowly adding. So the goal would be in the future to have all the items, at least in some form, on our online collection.
So it's an ongoing project.
Ongoing project.
Well, next question is about a specific piece in our collection that I believe is out right now. And that is the bull's head. What is the story of the bull's head?
The bull's head. Pendolito is his name. This was a bull. The fight took place in 1971 by a very famous bullfighter who was friends with Picasso, Dali, many artists, Luis Miguel Dominguez. So he fought this bull and won. And there were some friends of his at the bullfight. And as a sign of honor and respect, he then gave them the head, the ears, and the tail, as a gift to them. So that was in 1971. Now, fast forward to 2013, the heir of the beneficiary gave that to the museum as a gift in honor of her mother. So it's a very special item, though many people may find that strange, but this bullfighter had a direct connection with Dalí, knew him well. And so now we have that in our collection.
Interesting. Now, our next question is about, unlike the bull's head, which is currently out with the Picasso exhibition, this is about things that aren't. So are there any pieces in our collection that haven't been on display or have only been on display a handful of times?
I'll start with the handful of times, and generally that is drawing, works on paper, just because of the light requirements and things like that. And that would be his childhood sketches. We have shown them in the past. In Cleveland, they were shown a lot. But on paper, what I have is they've only been shown once. And these are from 1916, circa 1916, 1918. So sketches that Dalí did when he was between 12 and 14. So that is one item that just a handful of times, rarely seen. There's also a lot of objects like medallions and coins that we don't show generally. I'm not sure if we plan to in the future, maybe on some online exhibits once I can gather all the information. Also, some early drawing were the Uncle Vincent from 1926, I believe. So those aren't shown very often either, and they were illustrations for a book. So it is our hope that we will show these sometime in the future.
Now, the last question, almost it makes me laugh because one finds that you can't work at this museum without getting a few of these emails or a few of these verbal inquiries. And that is, a question about authentication requests, people who think that they might have a Dali or that their aunt, uncle, grandma might have a Dali. What's the protocol for those?
The protocol, and we do get these all the time, and they have gotten these types of letters for decades since the opening of the museum. We are not allowed to authenticate. We are a nonprofit. We do not authenticate Dali's works. So what we can do is we can give them information from a reliable source. And here it would be a catalog raisonné of the prints. There's 3 major ones. So we take scans from those. So then it's not our view. This is from a printed publication. And then we're able to send that off. And then we have a list of appraisers across the United States and the world where people can search, because we cannot appraise either. So we offer that to inquiries as well. And if someone's looking to sell an item, we have a list of an auction house directory that we then forward to inquiries.
Okay. Oh, I'm not sure if I'll remember all that. So the next time I get one, I'm going to forward it to you.
You can certainly do that. We do them all the time throughout the day.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for helping us answer some of these questions from our viewer mailbag.
You're welcome. And I encourage people, a lot of times people think archives and all that stuff is boring, but if you find any of this interesting, I encourage people, email. I'm happy to find out information if I didn't know it the first time around. And I just really want people to know it's there. We're getting stuff, especially with the archives, more on our digital collection. So you can actually see some of these items in the archive. And it's on our website, Center for Avant-Garde. And I just really encourage people to take an interest and look and see what we have.
And if people do have follow-up inquiries, what email should they use?
library@thedali.org.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank you again.
You're welcome.
So thanks, everyone, for joining us for this special episode. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. I never thought I'd be talking about tennis balls and mentally bent forks today. So, that's just a taste of all the cool things that we have in the archives. So remember, if you have any questions for our next viewer mailbag episode, be sure to send them to info@thedali.org and follow the tangent in the subject line. Or you can always send an inquiry to Snail Mail, care of me, Kim McQuarrie, at 1 Dali Boulevard, St. Petersburg, Florida, 33701. And until we meet again, signing off. Have a good one.